Dire wave.
3.
Our anthropology is not derived by human psychology or, empirical data from MIT or something like this. It's derived from the revealed aspect of what we see in Christology. And so there's no real way to diagnose man's problem and to understand man and man's anthropology, as I said, without the right theology.
All right. How are y'all doing? So Jeremy should be joining here in a sec. Hopefully everybody can hear me good. Y'all having a good day out there? It's nice to change the tone, change the climate. Could you make me a coffee, a double shot? Thank you.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry about earlier.
No problem.
I had my daughter from school, and I was traveling, so I got a little confused about the time.
No worries. Glad you're here. How are you?
Okay. Made it, yeah. Okay, I'm doing fine, yeah.
Pleasure to meet you. And you are one of the key guys over at, as we said, Covert Action magazine. And so, we had a mutual friend reach out and said that you'd like to have a conversation. And I thought it'd be great because we do cover a lot of cults over here on my end. And you've been doing a lot of work recently on the Jonestown Cult, and we've covered that a little bit in the past, but I only kind of know the overviews of it. So, Jeremy, where would you like to begin? And maybe if you want to give us a little background on you, what you're into over at Covert Action Magazine, what you guys do, and then we'll get into old Jim Jones.
Sure. Covert Action Magazine was founded in the 1970s by CIA whistleblower Philip Agee. Agee had worked with the CIA in South America, and he was horrified by some of the things he was made to do, including participation in illegal coups and torture. So he resigned from the agency. I wrote a tell-all memoir, Inside the Company, which I recommend to listeners. And he helped found Covert Action Magazine, which now, is trying to continue his legacy of exposing covert operation and providing critical reflection on U.S. foreign policy. And he was good in analyzing the political economic imperatives that drove U.S. imperialism, like in Latin America. So we try and include, political economic analysis. And with regards to Jonestown, I did a study of that. And there are a couple of good, they're kind of obscure books that listeners can get through through their local library, or they may be available for free on the internet. One is by Michael Myers, did a very detailed study, and John Judge was another person who really probed into Jonestown. Now, the surface story is that Jonestown was this kind of religious cult. It was led by Jim Jones, who's this very charismatic preacher who claimed that he could heal people and even resurrect the dead. And he built a huge following. He also presented himself as somebody who could heal the racial wounds of America. And his church was very diverse and brought into the fold a lot of African Americans. And then he started in Indianapolis, and then he moved to California, and he got involved kind of with the countercultural scene, and he was like recruiting people who were in the hippie movement because he had a very idealistic message, and the People's Temple was involved in protests against the Vietnam War. But there was a sinister underside. He developed, cultivated this like cult-like following. There was some strange, sexual rituals he would perform in front of his congregation, and he was very abusive. And he actually developed like a file card system that resembled the CIA to keep information of all the members, and he would even blackmail them. He would have them sign like blank papers, and he would actually insert like them admitting to certain criminal activity, so he could blackmail them, or he would expose things or know things about their private life through surveillance that he could expose them. So he used like methods of like the FBI to try and blackmail people and keep them loyal. And there's suspicious story, people who fell afoul of the church or were trying to expose some of the sinister underside, and they turned up dead. And it appeared that they were murdered.
Yeah.
And then he set up this colony in Guyana, Jonestown, that was supposed to be this like idealistic place where these parishioners would go and work the land and develop this kind of commune and live out their value system. And I think they did quite well, as far as the agricultural development. But there's evidence there's evidence about Jones himself that he was actually in the CIA for many, many years, going back to the early 60s. And the evidence is pretty convincing. For instance, firstly, he was connected with a guy named Dan Mitrione back from his time in Indiana. Mitrione was the head of was part of the USAID's Office of Public Safety.
Yeah.
Which
was he under some kind of like evangelical cover in Latin or Peru or Brazil or somewhere like that? Am I thinking of the right person?
Yes, Jones. Well, no, Mitrione was under the cover of the Office of Public Safety. That trained foreign police forces under the cover of a civilian agency, but they're mostly CIA agents. Mitrione was a police officer from Richmond, Indiana, which was a town near where Jones was preaching. Apparently, their relationship went back to Jones, the early part of Jones's career, and they lived near each other in Brazil, and they associated with each other in Brazil. Now,
that's right.
Jones, went to Brazil under the cover of like an evangelical mission.
Yes. Okay, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, and also under the cover, like officially, he was working for like a laundry company and another company, but the people said he never worked there. And he lived in a very fancy neighborhood in Rio and Belo Horizonte, and a car would pick him up, and he would be gone all day. He had a briefcase, and he was dressed well, and he was out in the Brazilian press as a CIA agent. And that was the time that the CIA was involved in plotting coups against Pau Goulart, was this kind of like a Lula type leader, more center left. To challenge some of the economic dominance of the U.S. and Brazil and large corporations, adopt more independent foreign policy. He was not a Castroite. He was more like a left of center. But the CIA, thought he was too left wing, too sympathetic to the communists, and they mounted a coup against him, and that brought in around 20 years of military rule in Brazil. And Bolsonaro relates to current politics. Revered the Brazilian military, which had ruled for 20 years. So it's believed that Jones was involved in that coup, and then as a CIA agent, and he was out in the Brazilian press and had to leave Brazil. And he was there in the early 60s. Then he went to Guyana, and he forged a very close relationship at that point with Forbes Burnham, who was the dictator of Guyana. And the CIA was also involved in a coup there because Burnham overthrew the first leader after Guyana got their independence was Cheddi Jagan, who was an Indian. In Guyana, there's an Indian population and a black population who were kind of at odds. And the CIA, and it's believed Jones' job was to stir racial unrest and to stir up the black population against Cheddi Jagan by like promoting black power. Because on the surface, Forbes Burnham was a proponent of Black Power and the non-aligned movement, but he was really a very corrupt leader who sold a lot of the country's interests out to foreign, multinational corporations. So it's believed that Jones was working for the CIA in Guyana and forged this very close relationship with Forbes Burnham, and that's how Jonestown ended up moving to Guyana in the 70s.
I was going to ask you that. Like, how do we get this weirdo guy, in San Francisco or whatever area he's at? How do we get him all the way down there? And if you see me looking down, it's because I'm taking notes on everything you're saying. So.
Great.
So don't think I'm not ignoring you. I'm writing down all these great facts. So yeah, that's a great puzzle piece because again, I kind of just know the overall story here and the kind of some of the conspiracy theoretical approaches. Not talking about you, but just kind of the theories that are out there, like the Myers book and this kind of stuff, which I've not read that. So it's great for you to help kind of piece this story together. So anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead and continue.
My pleasure. Yeah, and then it's believed that on the surface, again, they went there as part of this mission to work the land and establish this kind of commune, this utopian hippie commune. But it's believed there's evidence that actually the CIA was involved. There are a lot of the people very close to Joan, not just Joan, but people close to him were connected to the CIA. And there was a guy, Phil Blakey, who was involved in the early development of the colony of Jonestown. And it's believed that there was a side area, an adjunct to the where the church parishioners went, where they were actually a paramilitary training camp for mercenaries who were then sent to Angola, where the CIA was involved in an operation to unseat the left-wing MPLA, which is still, I believe, in power in Angola, which started as a left-wing political party and movement against the Portuguese. And the U.S. was supporting UNITA, a rival nationalist group that was more right-wing. So it's believed they were training mercenaries. And then it's believed that there may have been an ulterior agenda behind the Jonestown, that it was used because the Operation MK Ultra was an infamous CIA operation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about next is the MK Ultra connections.
Exactly. So MK Ultra, it was this sinister program run by the CIA where they believed that the Chinese had perfected brainwashing techniques of American prisoners of war, like in the Korean War, and so they were trying to emulate the Chinese and develop like truth serums that could get people to talk in interrogation. I think that was the basis behind MK Ultra, and they did these unethical testing of drugs, often on unwitting people, and there was all kind of unethical experiments that went on, and this was exposed in the U.S. Congress in the early to mid 70s, and officially MK Ultra was abolished. But there was a paper written by a Berkeley professor who investigated this, and he believes, among others who've investigated it, that after it was officially abolished, the CIA began to use religious cults, which would be, in many ways, make some sense from their point of view, because like people like Joan were very good at brainwashing and manipulate. Like Jones's specialty was to manipulate people. And he manipulated people into having sex with him, into following him loyally, into giving up their lives to join this cult-like organization and devote their lives to him. And so who better than to perform further experiments on people as part of the MK Ultra? And there's evidence that after the disaster at Jonestown, we can go into what might have happened there when all those people got killed. They found all kinds of pharmaceuticals, including Thorazine and many other drugs that had been associated with experiments in the MK Ultra, and sedatives and all kinds of drugs that you wouldn't really need to treat people medically. And that lent weight to Myers' argument that this was a place for MK Ultra
Right.
testing.
That was going to be
And people,
my next question was, do you think, did you come across information that this might have been part of MK Ultra, like as in sort of a research or an experiment? I've always wondered if the whole Jonestown thing might have just been an experiment in how far can we get people to go in terms of their commitments to some invented worldview as a test or something like that. Will they even essentially off themselves? Can you convince people to do something like this? So again, it's nice to hear that kind of analysis because that's kind of what I suspected about the MK Ultra elements of this.
yeah, and there was evidence of sensory. They were using sensory deprivation methods. If they had to punish or discipline somebody, they developed a system of using sensory deprivation, which is what the CIA used, and it became publicized in the War
Yeah,
on Terror
exactly.
when they were. So they were experimenting with those kind of methods. They were experimenting with drugs. The few outsiders who were able to visit said people looked like zombies there. They looked like robots. It was clear that they had been drugged and manipulated. So there's very strong evidence for this. Now, as far as yeah, what you're saying, I would generally agree, but it's believed that a lot of the people were murdered and not the official story that they all committed suicide
Uh,
because something went wrong and Jones panicked and but actually there was an investigation, there was a forensic pathologist, Leslie Mutu, and he found that most people had been shot, that they had signs of being injected in the back with something, that their body positions did not reflect people who would have been drugged or committed suicide, because the bodies were all neatly lined up, and if they had drank this poison, their bodies would have been contorted, and they would have been the place would have been an actual absolute mess. Instead, the bodies were kind of neatly lined up as if they had been placed there, and there were marks on their back that looked like they had been injected from the back, and others were shot. And some had tried to run away, and there's clear evidence of numbers of people having been shot. And then Jones somehow got away, it believed, because they found the body, but it kind of looked like Jones, but then upon close scrutiny, it wasn't him. It didn't have, there's I think a tattoo, or
well,
Jones didn't
yeah.
have one.
Let me ask you this. So is the are we thinking then that maybe what was going on was this was a cult that was down there maybe as a front or an operation for what weapons, money laundering, or not weapons transfers, maybe something else, maybe to have a little kind of a base for Western intelligence, something like that could be set up, or do you think it was purely an experiment that was being run that went bad, and then we had people that maybe wanted to get out? Because I know there was a story of someone passing a note right to one of the congressmen saying, "Help us, get us out of here." And then it wasn't a congressman that ended up dead over that. Isn't that part of the story?
Yeah, well, part of the story is that there was a Congressman, Leo Ryan, who had sponsored the Ryan Hughes Amendment, which was a strong piece of legislation to establish much greater congressional scrutiny over the CIA, and basically would have made it very difficult for the CIA to carry out any paramilitary or regime change
Uh huh.
operations. And so he was, public enemy number one for the CIA, and they lured him down there. Now he was interested in cults because apparently his daughter, he was in the district in San Francisco. He was a congressman, and then his daughter got involved in some cult in Oregon. So he was an anti-cult crusader, but he was lured down there, and then he was assassinated in what appears to be a professional
Yeah.
military assassination
Wow.
that was either carried out by the CIA or military special forces. And I think that was, then the mass killings occurred right after Ryan was slaughtered.
Now,
So
am I correct? I'm going from memory. The story was that he was like on the way out of there, right? Like heading towards a plane or something when they shot him. Is that right? Something like that.
yeah, he came
Yeah.
there and they gave a good show as to that, things were all rosy there and they fed him a nice meal. But then as he was leaving, yeah, he was ambushed and assassinated along with members of his entourage. And there was I think one of his aides was Jackie Spire, who became a congresswoman, and still, I believe, in the U.S. Congress in California. So yeah, it would be interesting to talk to her to see what she has to say today, if she's willing to talk, because a lot of people don't want to talk about this because they were very, I think, as you said, they were powerful interests at the top of this thing. And yeah, this has the
Yeah.
appearance of being some kind of intelligence front where they were doing these experiments, and they may have been also involved with mercenary training, gun running,
Exactly. Yeah, that's
kind
what
of
I was
illegal
wondering.
activities.
Was
And that's what they didn't want exposed. And Ryan
right?
may have been on the threshold of exposing all that, in addition to supporting this anti-CIA legislation. So he was, I think, one of the first, or if only, U.S. congressman who was assassinated while in the U.S. Congress. And I think he was a good
Wow.
man overall. Um, so yeah, it's a disturbing and dark story, really.
Yeah. So I was wondering too about that connection to the, because I knew that I did an interview with a guy who had done a bunch of cult research maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and we did an episode on Jonestown, and I think he had mentioned something to do with earlier on in Jim Jones's life, some sort of intelligence connection. So that actually ties things together a lot better, and it would make a lot more sense why he would be down in that area because of the intense operations going on in the Cold War to between Soviets and the CIA down there. That makes perfect sense, and I'd never thought about that that whole regime change element to it, but that would make perfect sense too, added to the MK Ultra connections there. I remember somebody
If
even.
I can add, if I can
Yeah,
add
sure.
one point, is that they
Sure.
tried to, I think, create this identity for Jones that he was like loyal to Cuba and that he was allied to the Soviet Union. But yeah, I think that was all part of the cover to masquerade that he was really a CIA operative. And they did the same thing with Lee Harvey Oswald. They made people want to
Yeah.
think that he was tied to the Fair Play for
Soviet.
Cuba committee. It's called like creating a legend,
Yeah.
and the CIA is very good at that. It's like psychological warfare. And I think part of the aim was also there was maybe a side aim of discrediting like the 60s movements and facilitating the rightward shift in American politics because Jones was identified as somebody on the left, and he attracted like the crowds from the hippies, in San Francisco were flocking to him.
Yeah,
And
it was
so
people think
this
the
was
same thing could have been the case with figures like Manson. I don't know if you've seen the
exactly.
recent. Yeah, so Manson was this sort of image of a hippie, but then he turns into
Yeah,
this total
but he was
psycho.
nothing like a hippie. He was really a
Yeah,
criminal who the
psycho
CIA
criminal, right?
recruited just to give a bad image for the hippies. And I think Jones was the same thing to make like the whole counterculture seem like a kind of cult. Uh, so
Yeah, Dave McGowan has a really good book called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, and in that book he argues that a lot of those the genuine anti-war sentiment that was going on in the 60s was actually steered into this kind of crazy, degenerate, hippie lifestyle stuff by establishment figures who were used, like Manson, for example.
mhm.
So yeah, I think that would make sense that
Yep.
this Jim Jones clown would be one of these kind of same characters where he's this rabid Marxist. And I remember when we did, I have a friend that wrote a couple of essays on Jones, and he portrayed himself too as this a Marxist socialist that would set up an experimental kind of commune, and that was all of those cult leaders at that time were supposedly setting up these communes, and what they turned out to be was in many cases, maybe not every case, but sort of establishment connected things. And if I recall, similar scenario with Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate. If I recall, he had some connection, I think, to various agencies or intelligence apparatus. Have you heard of
I would
that?
agree with your assessment. Well, I don't know that case, but I know the Jones case. I know the Manson case because there's a good book by Tom O'Neill, which I read
Yeah, the Tom
about
O'Neill book's
that.
good. Yeah.
And I know how the CIA operated, like with Lee Harvey Oswald, how they created this legend for him, and it's a psy war. Yeah, they want to denigrate, and it's quite possible the CIA was behind, or FBI, the Weather Underground. Because like in my opinion,
Right.
SDS was like a viable political movement. They had political objectives to end the Vietnam War and to develop a kind of a strong left wing a cohort either within or outside the Democratic Party, and they could have been a force in American politics. But then you have these crazy Weather Underground who just start like going in the streets and smashing people's cars, who have nothing to do with the war, and planting bombs. And I mean, it alienated so many people from the anti-war movement, and either they were just stupid as far as their strategizing, or this was intelligence agents
Well,
behind
yeah,
it.
yeah, if you remember Bill Ayers, right? Like he
Yeah,
went on to be an
yeah,
establishment academic
yeah. He
figure.
served no jail time.
Yeah, he's an
He
establishment.
bombed so many buildings. Who knows
Yeah,
how many people? A few got killed, I believe, and he serves almost no jail time. And then he's elevated to this position as a professor in a top university,
and
and
he's
he's
also
tight with
part of
Barack
one of
Obama.
these. He's
And
part of one
same
of
with
these.
Bernadine Dorn, and they were
Yeah,
very sketchy people. Yeah, they like got their. They were like Weather Underground was a cult. And they got their leader, the people. They manipulated people to do crazy things, and they made out pretty well. Those two, so that's very suspicious.
there's a similar pattern with this too, if I recall, in the Symbionese liberation with the Patty Hearst case, right? That seems to be some kind of this radical leftist group is engaged in just insane. I mean, now there are a radical leftist group, but oftentimes what we find is this kind of a situation where the person who's really in the background, and the same thing with the far right groups, right? A lot of times, who's the person who's in the background is this sort of shady Fed figure or informant figure or whatever. This is almost always the case with the really extreme, for example, identity groups, right? Where if I recall the history of the Black Panthers, you had the same thing where one of the FBI informants was Richard Aoki, and he eventually went public and said, "Oh yeah, my job was to go in and make them look crazy, radical, and ridiculous," and it worked because it then sort of emasculated or dismantled the movement's energy and made them look silly in the media. And then
Yeah,
now what we have, in the more recent instantiations of these kinds of things, like the new Black Panther Party, where they're openly able to call for violence, and really all that does is just feed into the machine to get people involved in entrapment, involved in jail time. It's I've been reading a lot on Gladio recently, and this was really the whole model of Gladio as well. So it goes on in the left and the right, where the establishment will really sort of create these groups, steer these groups, ultimately to entrap people.
yes. I think there's a long track record of that. And yeah, there's a clear political agenda at play. And they want to ramp up the surveillance state and the
Right.
police state because it puts people on edge that these are extremists and they're a threat to the republic, nation, so they can justify ever higher budgets for the FBI and military policing organizations. So it serves a number of agendas.
There was another cult too that had a very similar pattern of the mass suicides or being killed. Order of the Solar Temple. Have you looked into that?
I haven't, no.
That was a Canadian and French-based right-wing cult that pulled from the writings of Aleister Crowley and other occultists, and that ended up being, I think, 50 or 60 people. I think it's the biggest one next to Jonestown in terms of what they call, as a mass suicide cult. And then I think after that is Heaven's Gate, if I recall. But yeah, I mean, Order of Solar Temple, whoever that guy was that was running that, I can't remember his name, but he actually did have also intelligence connections and was busted for drug running, busted for weapons and arms trafficking. So the cult leaders are always like engaged in, blackmail. Osho's cult. You know about Osho, right?
No, I haven't studied those cases, no.
Well, they're very similar. There's a really good documentary that's a mainline documentary, Wild Wild Country, which is about Rajneesh, the Osho cult, and that was also the same thing where they were trafficking in arms and doing a lot of the mind control, drugging the people. They got to be a really really large cult, and they tried to take over a town I think Oregon or somewhere. It's a really wild story, but it bears the same patterns. I don't know if there's off the top of my head an intelligence connection there, but that Netflix documentary bears this out. And I'm just pointing out the patterns that when we see these kinds of cults, we usually find the cult leader or people in the background or have these sort of shadow intelligence world connections going on. So what was in the case of to go back to Jonestown, was there did they not do any good investigation into this? Was it all kind of shut down, or was it just over when they had this story that everybody killed themselves? Did
Yeah,
nobody really probe this?
there was a huge cover up, and something that was really strange was that the CIA like knew about this well before even the Guyanese authorities, and there were some CIA figures there And actually, one of the last, they had a video recording of Jones saying, get Dwyer out of here. We don't want him. And Dwyer was Richard Dwyer, who was in the U.S. Embassy and believed to be a CIA operative. So he was there like most of the time, but then they got him out, because they wanted to make sure he wasn't hurt or something. And then the CIA somehow knew, like in the middle, because this happened, I think, in the night, and they knew, like the CIA knew about this somehow early in the morning, like 2, 3 a.m. And they knew well before the Guyanese authorities came on the scene, and there was a lot of manipulation of the scene before the Guyanese authorities had come. And then, there was a huge cover up after, as to what had happened to these bodies. And I think there's some, mysteries as far as some people, their bodies were never identified, and a couple like turned up a few years later. Like one body turned up in California, a few years later in like a storage or something. So there's a lot of really odd things if you look into it. And yeah, the whole thing is just really suspicious.
Yeah, I don't mean to keep jumping on other topics, but it seems like I remember when I was reading about Mark David Chapman. Seems like he also had some connection to being a part of some evangelical mission group, and he went maybe to Latin or South America. I can't remember. Have you heard that?
He was the murderer of John Lennon, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And there might have.
I read a book about this a while ago, and I know there were some strange things about him. And there's a question like with Sirhan, whether some
Right.
of these people were programmed assassins, and were part of MK Ultra and brainwashing experiments. And I believe there's some indication that he may have been. I can't remember all the details about his case, but I know there's some really, really strange things, as well as the
Yeah.
murder, the attempted assassin of Ronald Reagan came from a very well-connected family who even knew the Bushes, and
Yes.
he's also something worth looking into.
Yeah,
So
and
there is
that
a
ties
pattern you
into the
can see.
mafia
Yeah.
too. The organized crime plays a big role in this too. If I remember, Mark David Chapman, I think presented to before he shoots Lennon, he gave a gun or a bullet, a golden bullet or something like that, to Kenneth Anger. And so, Kenneth Anger is, of course, famous occultist, Crowleyan figure out in the niche of Hollywood back in the day, the Hollywood Babylon figure. But the reason that matters is that also ties into this kind of intelligence deep state apparatus, that there's always this overlap between cults and intelligence, especially during the Cold War. Um, yeah, so guys, if you would, if you want to submit your super chats, you can do that via the Streamlabs function. Streamlabs is how we do super chats over here. We were demonetized, as you all know, in 2018, I think. So if you want to ask questions regarding this, you can do so right there. As we said, Jeremy is over at Covert Action Magazine. You can follow him. His channel is linked. The website is linked as well, and there's just a wealth of information going back to many, many years of whistleblowers, many, many years of articles, and people over there critiquing a lot of the stuff that you see us critiquing over there. And yeah, you're right to point out at the chat there that Dan Mitrione was, I think, under USAID cover. And I want to say that there was something similar going on with Mark David Chapman's connections to because for a time he was in this evangelical group and he was like doing foreign mission work, right? And then he comes back and seems to go crazy. There's something with that with Berkowitz as well. Berkowitz was part of an evangelical group doing that for a little while when he was young, and then he comes back. And that's a pattern we see, actually. So this is important because, as you guys know, oftentimes missionary work can be a cloak or a cover for intelligence operations. And the Red Cross and USAID have been classic versions of that. Is there anything else that you know about that kind of cover that goes on? I know you guys cover a lot of that over at Covert Action Magazine. Could you speak maybe to the usage of missions work and this kind of stuff?
Well, traditionally, yeah, those can and have provided covers for intelligence operatives, certainly a relief aid. I mean, even going back to Herbert Hoover, like following the Russian Revolution, Herbert Hoover, I believe, was head of the Red Cross, and that was used to funnel aid to the whites. The United States actually invaded Russia and was supporting the white, former Tsarist officers against the Reds in the Russian Civil War. And they used the Red Cross in the cover of relief aid to funnel supplies to the White Army and the ex-Tsarist officers who were trying to promote regime change against the Bolsheviks. So it goes back over 100 years
Well, what
now.
do you think about Sutton's work? Because in Sutton's book, he argues that the industrialists and the elites in the West were funding both sides of that to control that. What's your take on that?
It's an interesting analysis. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily dispute what he's saying. I do know from my study of that history that there was the Wilson administration, yeah, poured a lot of money and men to support the whites in the Russian Civil War. And I mean, there's a long pattern of the U.S. opposing communist or left-wing governments. So I think that set the standard for the rest of the Cold War. But yeah, Sutton is a very good researcher. I read his book on the Wall Street and the Nazis, and so it'd be worth considering
Yeah,
what he
I would say
said.
yeah, check out the one he did on the Bolsheviks too, because he
Mhm.
points out that there was a funding. He argues that entities like Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, American Industrial Corporation in particular were kind of hedging their bets, and so
Yeah,
early on there's funding for Trotsky, and then he argues that they later on thought that they might hedge their bets and also fund what you're talking about, the whites, if there was a reaction against the Bolsheviks that was, or the Soviets that would be successful.
yeah. Well, that's
That
a
was his argument.
traditional strategy they'll use. They'll try and co-opt
Yep.
even left-wing or communist movements to serve their own ends and to ensure that they keep some influence there. And I know like the Bolsheviks, despite their nationalization decree, they allowed some private enterprise into Russia, including the oil company made out very well, even under Stalin. So, and that was in part because of their technological savvy that the Russians felt they needed to develop their oil. But so I could see what he's arguing, and yeah, he's a very interesting
Yeah.
writer.
His story is also kind of backed up with Dr. Carol Quigley's writings. Have you seen that stuff like
I've
Tragedy
read
and
some
Hope?
of him, and yeah, he's also a very good historian. Yeah, who looks at the Anglo-American elite,
Well,
and yeah,
and
they're very.
he's an apologist for it too. He's saying
Yeah,
this
he's
is
an
why we had to.
apologist, but he provides good
Yeah.
information on them so you can understand how they think and operate. And they're very crafty. I mean, yeah,
Right.
they will play just like in US politics, they play both sides, they hedge their bets, and they're out for their own self-interest. So at the end of the day, and they try and co-opt movements even that they don't like. I can
Well,
see
we
that.
saw haven't we seen a similar pattern too? For example, in the the past 20 years of the war on terror, where we see the West essentially co-opting and using very radical Islamic groups many times over. And this is actually an older British imperial strategy where the British Empire would kind of co-opt and utilize the very, very, very radical Islamic sects for all kinds of. In fact, Miles Copeland, in his famous biography, Game of Nations, he has a whole section where he says, "Of course we use these people." He says they're crazy dupes, but they're great to get big terror events going when we need them.
But yeah, well, there's a book I read called Devil's Game by Robert
Yes. Oh,
Dreyfus, and
I
it's
did a
called
talk on that. It's a great book. Yeah.
yeah, it's a great book, and he goes into like in the '50s there was some kind of conference in Princeton where all these Ivy League intellectuals like met with these Egyptian Islamists who were against Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's a secular nationalist, and they basically developed this strategy that in the Cold War
Yes.
the U.S. should ally with Islamists, and we've seen that pattern repeatedly. In recent years, we've seen in Syria, we've seen in Libya. We've seen it in well with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a major exporter of Wahhabi terrorism and Sunni terrorism. And we've seen in the Caucasus, the U.S. has allied at a time with the Chechen forces fighting the Russians. So yeah, it's a strategy, an imperial strategy, as you say, borrowed from the British Empire, which did that repeatedly. And Dreyfus goes into the interconnection. So
Yeah.
yeah, the war on terror is more a fraud. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just really an opportunity for the U.S. to expand its military power in the Middle East under the cover of fighting terror, but they're really supporting terror in numerous countries.
Yeah. And Nasser, Copeland talks about playing Nasser in the book, or he at least claims that, right? He says that there was a period where early on the CIA wanted to promote pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism, and then he says that then we decided 60s, 70s to flip that and go with supporting the more radical groups. So that was a better approach to control than trying to find unification for these regions. So and he talks about gaming and playing Nasser as a dupe in the book. So it's basically admitting the very points that you're saying from famous CIA operative Game of Nations. Everybody should read that book if you haven't read it. There's also another book that's great that ties into the Dreyfus book, which is Mark Curtis's book, Secret Affairs, and he's a Royal Society researcher. So here's somebody again from the Royal Society saying, "Oh yeah, here's how the whole system works with Britain's collusion with radical Islam." And Dreyfus's book is America's collusion but it's the same establishment basically having this policy. So yeah, great points there. Great book recommendation. Yeah. What's some other books you would always, when I get really well-educated, well-read people in here, I always like to ask them, what books they recommend. And do you have a book? Should we do one you want to promote or anything like
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I published 4 books. Actually, I'm going to publish a book on Bill Clinton and his foreign policy that includes discussion of his time when he was the governor of Arkansas and his role in covering up the MENA clandestine operation to arm the Contras and the drug running and the corruption that went on in Arkansas, and how that set the groundwork for his presidency, where he often did unleash the CIA, and he was a very interventionist president, despite, I think, allusions to the contrary. And it set the groundwork for, Hillary the Hawk Clinton. I mean, they're both two sides of the same coin. So
Did you know that? Did you know? How dare you speak that way to me? Did you know that Did you know my mentor was Professor Carol Quigley at Georgetown?
yeah, exactly.
That was my mentor.
That's how I came at Quigley. So, but yeah, and I published before that a book on Obama. It was called Obama's Unending Wars: Fronting the Foreign Policy of the Permanent Warfare State, and that was published by Clarity Press in 2019. And in that book, yeah, I went into Obama's family and connection with the CIA, and also his time in when he was the state legislator in Illinois. And I was able to interview some people from the Black community, and they really disliked him. He was really a sellout for their community. He did nothing to advance the interests of that community, and he was tied with corrupt figures like Tony Rezko. And he's just like an immoral power player, like a lot of these politicians, I guess. And he was tied with General Dynamics, and General Dynamics is one of the largest weapon makers in the world, the Crown family, and they were involved in the manufacture of drone technology. And Obama was the drone king, so
Right.
you can put 2 and 2 together. And he expanded the warfare state. His military budgets were higher than Bush. He bombed, I think 7, 8 countries. I mean, he kind of went more with the Empire Light approach, like the drone, special forces. But he escalated the war in Afghanistan. The Libya invasion was really as bad as Iraq. It didn't get the same opposition and attention, but it was devastating for the people of Libya. I mean, that country went from one of the strongest economies in Africa to a failed state, the reintroduction of slavery, the rise of jihadist groups, and it's a civil war, and just a complete and utter catastrophe. So it really, I mean, a disastrous presidency in many ways, but he kind of walks on water. So somewhat like Clinton. So yeah, those are, I was studying, I guess, the pathologies of modern American politics through the lens of the Democratic Party and these alleged figures who command respect still in the mainstream, but just carried out atrocious actions.
Yeah,
And
it seems like there, for example, there used to be a pretty strong anti-war movement in the mid 2000s, and I remember I was, kind of young and getting into this kind of stuff in the mid 2000s, and getting into, Ron Paul type stuff back then, and I remember noticing that with the questioning of the Big Nine event that was going on, that was a pretty strong movement. The anti-war movement was pretty strong. When Obama came in, that basically killed all that, because people
Yeah.
thought that he was going to be the candidate standing on no. He campaigned on that kind of stuff, and then what we find out, oh, he's actually just the left quote liberal version of neocon. And then the so basically we started to see that they're the same, but it was effective because it neutralized anti-war movements, and it neutralized because it has liberal cover, right? So, Obama and Clinton are basically doing the same types of things with liberal cover, and then we're going to get a Hillary person. We were supposed to have a Hillary person, in the last few years, a type of a Hillary character. Hillary as the character that we're supposed to have, that's now the foil to Trump or whatever, or to whoever the fake right wing. But it's all the same establishment. What I'm trying to say would you agree with that? They're all just neocons, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. And they're tied with the military industrial complex very deeply. They're tied with the CIA very deeply. Yeah, that's why I go into both books, from the early point in their career. Clinton and Clinton appears to have been recruited when he was at Oxford.
Right, he
This
was
was
at Oxford,
admitted
yeah.
by Meyer Jr., and he went on some kind of mission with Strobe Talbot to smuggle out the Khrushchev diary when he was a student at Oxford. And nobody could understand how a poor kid from Arkansas could afford these travels into Russia and Eastern Europe. And Meyer admitted it was from the CIA. So he was with the CIA at that time, and he provided them a base for the Contra operations in Mena, Arkansas, with Barry Seal, which they made a movie about that. And Obama, his mother was in Indonesia in the 60s as an anthropologist, but she was working in East Java, which was a hotbed of the Indonesian Communist Party, and she had the requisite language skills to be reporting to the CIA. And even if she didn't directly work for the CIA, we don't have the proof of that, but she was involved with these agencies like Ford Foundation, USAID, that were very
Yeah,
instrumental in
foundations.
carrying out U.S. Cold War foreign policy, which was to support the Suharto government, which massacred hundreds of thousands of communists in Indonesia, and to make sure Indonesia was part of the free world, free world. That he was the worst, one of the worst dictators, certainly in that nation's history, and he ranks up there with some of the worst of the century. So, but yeah, and Obama's even his grandfather. There's evidence to suggest he was tied with the CIA or intelligence agencies, and he was actually appears to have coordinated this exchange with Barack Obama Sr. Because he was in a picture with Barack Obama Sr. That those were State Department / intelligence operations to bring promising future leaders like from Africa to study. Like University of Hawaii East West Center is like, they say it's like the School of the Americas for East Asia, and they bring like foreigners to study there so they can cultivate them as loyal assets of U.S. intelligence agencies, and so they go back to their country and they ally with the United States. Obama had that pedigree, and he even worked after college in Business International Corporation, which is listed as the CIA front organization. So, and then his whole memoir appears to have been, this whole story is based, a lot of it is made up, and it appears it was fabricated political propaganda to make him some kind of bridge figure who could promote diversity and stuff. But most of the story is actually false that he presents in his memoir. I could go on about that at length another time, but anyway, you get the picture that these guys they're basically like Manchurian candidates who are promoted
Yeah.
to advance certain kind of policies, and they have the charisma maybe and the speaking skills to fool people and to endear themselves to some people, but it's kind of a ruse, yeah. And unfortunately, Americans buy the false bill they're being sold every time. They kind of, each election they think this liberal candidate will be the savior of the country and undo all
Yeah.
the bad things, and they just do even worse once they get in office. So
Yeah, I want to remind everybody that Jeremy does have some articles that are more recent on recent conflicts, Ukraine conflict, and the past couple of years of the COOF. So I've linked his article because, of course, YouTube doesn't let you talk about these things. So you can read his critique of the COOF narrative of the last few years here. It's called Bioterror Expert and Whistleblower Alleges CIA Involvement in That Stuff. So there is that article of his you can read. And what's your, is this situation in the Ukraine just another version of this neocon NATO expansion, warmongering, to establish essentially this neoliberal order everywhere? Is that your take on that, or do you have a more nuanced take here?
I think it is. I think Ukraine has been used as a pawn, and its people
Yeah.
have suffered tremendously because of that. From the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think the U.S. saw an opportunity to dominate the entire region, and they tried to keep Russia weak. And they were succeeding when Russia had Boris Yeltsin as their leader, and then Putin came in, and he's a stronger leader. I mean, he has his good and bad thing, but the key point is that he's a stronger leader. I mean, he helped restore economic sovereignty for Russia's economy, and he was projecting Russian power in the region. That's what the U.S. doesn't want. They want a weak leader who, and they want to dominate the region. They were using Ukraine as a proxy. I mean, I mean, Victoria Nuland, the arch neocon, admitted that
Yeah, she
since
admitted that.
1991, the
Yeah.
U.S. had provided $5 billion to try and steer Ukraine into the pro-Western camp. And the U.S., the Obama administration, I mean, Obama is really the father of that war, that horrible war. He
Right.
backed the coup in 2014, and
Right.
Biden was the key figure. He was the key point man for the Obama administration in Ukraine. They backed a coup against a legitimate government that was pro-Russian, that triggered the eastern provinces to push for their autonomy. But the new post-coup government wanted to control them. They invaded the eastern provinces, attacked them, shelled them for 8 years. The people had to live in underground caves in many cases and shelters for years and years. Kids had to basically grow up in an environment of terror where they're being ceaselessly bombed. These militias, because many Ukrainians didn't want to fight their own people in eastern Ukraine. I mean, they're basically the same people, and so they had to raise these militias. Many of them were either neo-Nazis or just extremists, and there's all these foreign mercenaries came into the country, including a lot of American white supremacists, and they were terrorizing the people of eastern Ukraine. And this went on for years, and there was a
Right.
viable peace settlement, the Minsk Agreement, but Angela Merkel admitted that that was just like a ruse to buy
A
time
ruse. Yeah.
so they could build up their military arsenal to take it to the Russians. And inevitably, the Russians were going to couldn't tolerate this on their border, and they're going to try and protect the people of eastern Ukraine, what they did, and they got involved, and the rest is history. So I think it's a terrible war, and I was part of the Rage Against. I was glad to have been attendance at the Rage Against the War Machine
Yeah.
rally that brought together people across the United States of different political outlooks who might disagree on some domestic issues, but were unified that this is an unjust war and a waste. It's like Afghanistan. It's a waste of
Exactly.
our money, our precious resources. Afghanistan, the U.S. government wasted trillions of dollars. We see now that Taliban are back in power. I mean, what did it achieve? Afghanistan was just turned into a wasteland of opium addicts, and its people were
Exactly.
bombed.
Yeah, I think people are
And
starting to figure out that serving in these wars and supporting these wars, and not just Ukraine but the others going back many many years, it's not about not wanting to be patriotic. It's that I think a long time ago, a lot of people started, especially vets like you back in Vietnam, they were figuring out that we're not actually serving national defense. We're serving degenerate elites who are running giant money laundering drug operations. That's what people started
yeah,
figuring out.
exactly. It's a criminal racket. And I
Exactly.
mean, the Karzai government, the governments in Afghanistan were actually close to the Taliban, and they were kind of like playing a game. They would even fund them to keep the war
Yes.
going so they can keep getting all this money for themselves and build these lavish mansions with walled gates. Uh, and yeah, I mean, the government in Ukraine is extremely corrupt. It's among the most corrupt in Europe. Zelensky was cited in the Pandora Papers for offshoring money, and he had
Yep.
these mansions in Florida and Italy, and he's barred about 11 opposition parties, and they claim it's a fight for democracy against authoritarianism. But I mean, I went to Russia, and the Communist Party is legal. That's the leading opposition party in Russia, but in Ukraine it's banned. So which country is more democratic? I mean, they're both, I don't think it's a perfect democracy in Russia either, but it's I would say it's far more democratic than Ukraine under Zelensky, who's running a complete police state, and they're openly promoting terrorism. They basically admitted to murdering the daughter of an intellectual who's a young journalist through a car bomb. They've kidnapped and murdered many other dissidents against their government. And this was actually reported on the front page of the New York Times, that there were these commando units carrying out car bombings, in the elements of the Ukrainian military, that is. So the U.S. is supporting a terrorist government in Ukraine, much like Afghanistan or Iraq. And, America has, if you look around, you have homeless people, you have teachers who are abysmally paid, you have a healthcare system in disarray that, so there are just huge needs for money at home, and this is just criminal. As you said, these depraved elites are spending that money to enrich the coffers of military contractors, and their corrupt friends,
Right.
and they're neglecting their own people. And it's time for, I think, a revolution in the United States. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said that you can't have democratic government without periodic revolts. And when the elite become corrupt, it's really the responsibility of citizens to hold them in check and to periodically revolt. And I think we're way past that time where it's necessary. I mean, it's just unacceptable to squander billions of dollars on the most corrupt government in Europe and to threaten nuclear war. We're on the verge of potential world or nuclear war for nothing. Putin was, when he was first elected, he was the first one to call after 9/11 to offer sympathy to the United States. I mean, he started out, he was not at all an anti-American or somebody who wanted a conflict with the United States. He was much more moderate, actually, even within Russia.
Yeah.
And same in China, Xi Jinping called for a win-win cooperation, and yet we're picking a fight there too against a country that I think there's something like $800 billion in trade between the U.S. and China, and yet somehow we want to go to war with them.
Yeah, and again, like you said, the warfare here relates to specific groups of degenerate elite oligarch families who have a lot of interests. Obviously, everybody can see that one reason that the Bidens are so interested in Ukraine is that Hunter and Biden Sr. have been involved in Ukrainian politics and machinations publicly for so long. So certainly they have an invested interest. So is everybody really serving America's national defense by this NATO Ukraine conflict? No, it doesn't have anything to do with us. It has to do with these goobers and these goons profiting and money laundering and doing all kinds of nasty stuff. And everybody can see that now. It's just crazy. It's like people are really waking up to this unless they're just completely kind of asleep and have no idea what's going on. But whether you're right wing or left wing, it should be obvious that like nobody is benefiting from these policies for sure, except for them.
Absolutely, yeah. And with Biden, based on my research, I believe that Burisma may have been a front corporation to fund these militias, a CIA front, because Cofer Black was, as well as Hunter Biden, also appointed to the board of directors of Burisma was Cofer Black, who was the number 3 man at the CIA in the early years of the War on Terror. And once you're, in the CIA, you're always in the CIA. And they needed money. The company was under the head of Ihor Kolomoisky, who was a warlord, who was funding these militias. So I believe that was a CIA front operation. And Biden has a long career of supporting the CIA because he was, for a time, like in the early 80s, on the Senate Foreign Intelligence.
He was on the Intelligence Committee, yeah, and he had a significant piece, a role to play in the Big Nine events. I won't, but if you guys have seen the interviews that we done with Jason Burmis always points out that Biden was a key figure at that time in terms of what Biden said and what his role was when he talked about the money that was sent to the ISI. You know what I'm talking about? The 9/11 stuff with Biden and the ISI and all that.
I'm not as familiar with that.
It's a great clip. I'll try to dig it back up for you guys. If you find the interview that we did with Burmis, I think on the Big Nine event, it's on my Rockfin for those of you in the chat. But he makes a great point about the role that Biden was playing at the time of the Big 9 event. So Biden is a
It
fixture.
wouldn't surprise me because I think a lot of these people they keep the. I mean, it's so obvious now that Biden. I mean, he's practically completely senile, and it's an embarrassment for the United States to have a leader who can't really function and is way past his time. But so why did they promote him? It's because he's protecting all these secrets from coming out and crimes from being exposed. And that's why they like Clinton. They knew they could, she would protect them. I mean,
Exactly.
she was implicated in a lot of the criminal activity over
Yeah.
the years we've seen of this, as you point out, a government that's just gone off the rails. And there's a good book by Jonathan Marshall I would highly recommend. I forget the name. I did a review of it last year, and it's all about how organized crime basically took over the U.S. government, starting under Harry Truman. And Truman was tied with the Pendergast political machine in Missouri, and John Pendergast was like a mafia, and he
Yeah. Yeah.
passed this legislation to protect the mafia. It kind of started there, and like JFK and RFK started to go after the mob, and look what happened to
Exactly.
them.
Yeah, this is
And
something I've been
so,
digging into a lot more recently is the organized crime connections to all this stuff.
yeah,
By the way, for those that are interested, I did find I think it's this interview that we did with Burmis where he goes into detail, and I think he even plays the Biden clip that's relevant to all this. I'll put it in the chat for you guys right here. So that's I'm pretty sure where that is. It's from some months ago. We got a few super chats, and so guys, if you want to support the show, use that super chat function via Streamlabs. If you want to ask your questions, and we'll answer them. You can ask me, and if Jeremy is able, he will stick around and answer the questions as well. And I want to remind you guys who the show sponsor is, Chalk.com, the best supplements on the internet. Head on over to Chalk.com if you're looking for the ability to enhance your toxic masculinity 100%. So we all want to be more toxically masculine, at least in our audience we do. And you can do that by heading over to Chalk.com, CHOQ.com. Use the promo code J50 to get 50% off any of those peer-reviewed products that are over there, especially the Tonkat Ali. You can also use the promo code J53Life, that's J53LIFE, to get 53% off any recurring subscriptions. And I know when you use those recurring subscriptions, you're going to be happy because you want this coming every month. And they're a big supporter of our show. So we love Chalk.com, and I think you will too. And I want to remind you guys too that show sponsor is also Grand Theft World. Richard Grove over at Rockfin, Grand Theft World. They've had Whitney Webb. They've had all the great researchers out there that you guys know about. And so be sure and follow Grand Theft World on Rockfin. And it's, I think, Tragedy and Hope on YouTube is Richard's channel. So that's our sponsors. Be sure and support and follow them as well. And the first question is from Cossie. You may not know this, but Jim Jones probably had or likely had ties to William Branham. This history is worth looking into. Are you familiar with that connection?
no, what's the name? I'm going to write that down.
William Branham, Branham.
Okay. Actually, one thing I didn't mention was the connection with the Layton family. It's in this article, yeah, I wrote. You can find it at Covert Action magazine about Jonestown and CIA. Yeah, the Layton family, the father, they were a family from Berkeley, California, and the mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany who actually claimed to be Jewish, but evidence indicates her family were all Nazis. And the father was a very high, he was a director of major chemical warfare operation in the U.S. military and chemical warfare experiments. So that's another, and I think he worked at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, which was they performed a lot of experiments in chemical weaponry. And that family, actually, their son Larry Layton was one accused originally of shooting Leo Ryan, although they said he had looked drugged and he may have been a patsy. But the whole family was involved with the People's Temple, and they provided a lot of the financing. And the elder Lawrence Layton's ties to the U.S. Top levels of the U.S. military and Army Chemical Warfare Division adds to the strong possibility that Jonestown was used for intelligence purposes. and for all kinds of tests, including in drug testing and other military kind of experiments. So
Excellent. Yeah. So for those in the chat, I'm going to link Jeremy's profile on Covert Action, so you can scroll through and see all of the articles that he's written over the years. So here's his profile, and you can find the Jonestown article in there as well. Is it the Jonestown article's on that under you, right? On the website.
yeah,
I'm looking through the magazine.
yeah, it might take a bit of time to find.
2 or 3
Yeah, if you
pages back.
type it in Google, the problem is I think they don't like us on Google in the search
Right,
engine.
exactly.
So sometimes you put in Covert Action, like the Jonestown CIA, Kuzmarov,
It doesn't come
it
up.
should come up, but sometimes there's like a shadow banning that happens, and it could be a little bit hard to find. But I'm pretty sure you could find it on the website if you take a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm scrolling back. It's pulling up. I'm going back to like page 3.
I could put it if there's a chat. I can pull it up and put it in the chat.
Yeah, there is. You can stick it in there.
Okay.
Because it doesn't, for whatever reason, it's not letting me search Jonestown. But I can pull up your articles.
Okay, yeah, it does come up. I'll put it in the chat. I found it.
Okay,
It did
thank
come
you.
up
Yeah.
on Google.
All right, so let's see. Next super chat is Mr. Bleep, $5. What is the Orthodox response to critics who say that Christianity is repressive of women? They cite the problem of Eve, that she might have caused the fall. This is off topic. I sent this from after your stream yesterday. Yeah, it is off topic, but that's okay. I would just say that, Christianity believes that the classical Christianity teaches that all human beings are made in the image of God. And so everybody has dignity. So I would say that that's a unique element, especially in the ancient world, where women weren't seen to have much dignity. They were more so property. So I don't see how that would be deleterious to women. But here is Jeremy's article, and I'll put that in the chat for you guys right there on the Jonestown stuff. If you want to go deeper into that, which is our main topic today. Anything else you want to leave us with? It was a great interview, great overview. What do you guys got coming up over at Covert Action Magazine? Anything you want to push? Any hot button topics right now?
Sure. Well, we do. Keep an eye on our website. Actually, I think today or tomorrow there's an article about the FBI and FBI surveillance and COINTELPRO, and how they were even spying on Walt Rostow. This is how paranoid they are. This is more of a historical article, but they actually, were spying and thought Walt Rostow, who's one of the architects of the Vietnam War, and wrote like an anti-communist manifesto as a rebuttal to Marx. And the FBI even thought he was a communist at one point because he had some family members who had been communists. He kind of rebelled against his family. I think his parents, he came from like an immigrant Jewish family, and they were socialists. So because of that, they were suspicious, even though he kind of, wanted to fit into America and, adopt this kind of almost extreme anti-communist outlook. So it was based on a book by David Price I could recommend.
I read David Price.
Articles.
I read David Price's Weaponizing Anthropology, which is really good. What's the book you're talking about?
This is his new book. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The title, I'm always bad with titles. I forget the title, but it's a new book he's written. And then another article coming out in a week or two is on this forgotten CIA critic whose name was David. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but the first name was David, and he was in the U.S. occupation of Japan in World War II. He was in the U.S. military in World War II, and then he was appointed by General Douglas MacArthur to like the film branch when the U.S. occupied Japan, like to oversee films that were coming out. And he promoted more like left-wing film and film that promoted like labor struggle and more peace message. And MacArthur like fired him, and he was a victim of McCarthyism, but he stayed in Japan, and he wrote these biting analysis of U.S. foreign policy in Japan, and even how they were aligning with the far right, and the guy and were involved even from that time in the drug trade, because there's a guy, Yoshio Kodama, who's like a gangster, who MacArthur basically like befriended him, and he was supposed to be tried as a grade A war criminal, and he was like let off because he was doing useful services for the U.S. military against the communists and other groups, undesirable groups. And anyway, this guy David, I forget his last name. He wrote all these articles, and then he wrote a book that was published in Japan in 1970 called CIA Core of the Cancer. And it's really a brilliant and very detailed analysis about how the CIA operates, like, and especially he detailed how they promote propaganda, like in Japan and in the United States about Japan. And a lot of his stuff focuses on the Far East. He has sections on Korea and then Vietnam. And he discusses the Phoenix Project, and he's like an unknown critic because there's a small number of people who like exploded the agency, like Philip Agee. He became known through his book Inside the Company, and then there were some intellectual.
Doug Valentine's books.
Yeah, and that came out later. But this guy was like around the 40s and 50s.
Oh wow!
And he was writing all these articles, and a lot of them were more, I guess, published internationally, and some were published in Japanese and then translated. But he was a guy from California. And he wrote like 6 books, and and many of the books were in English. Some were published like in overseas publishing houses. So I don't think he was that well known in the he's dead now, but so he's left a lot of writings about the CIA and its operations, including in Japan, which doesn't get a lot of attention, as well as places like Korea and Vietnam, in the early phase of U.S. CIA involvement, and Indonesia. And he goes a lot into the propaganda and the co-optation of academics. So it's really interesting to read his stuff.
And you said that his first name is David, and you don't remember his last name?
If you give me a minute, I could look at, I'll find his name.
Yeah, let's see. The next question is Rolf Stakes $10. This is a great talk, you guys. Could you say something about the cartels in Mexico and their connection to anything to do with CIA or covert operations? I'm sure there is that connection. It's not an area I know a whole lot about, but I'm going to be reading Dope Inc. next, and John McCoy's book Politics of Heroin. So those get into international drug, relations and all that. And the Gladio book that I'm reading right now covers, you guys, that we've been recommending. The Paul Williams Gladio book is really good. And I think he mentions cartels a little bit in there, but not Mexico per se. But when it comes to Escobar and all that was all connected to Western intelligence. And the Escobar was putting money into 8 different Vatican shell banks. So, have you heard anything about that? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, and I just looked up his name, David W. Condi. He's not well, I think nobody would know his name. I didn't know him, but yeah, he's written all these manuscripts that hopefully might be published. And for anyone who wants to learn about the history of the CIA and all the dark things they've done, he's really and how they use psychological manipulation, manipulate public opinion. His book is really valuable.
Is it Condi, Condi, like Condi?
No, Conde.
DE. Okay.
Yeah, and my article about him will be published like in the next 2 weeks. So
cool. Yeah, we'll look for that.
Yeah. And then about the drug trade, I missed the last part. Yeah, the McCoy Politics of Heroin is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. McCoy risked his life. I met him a couple times. He's a really smart guy who's gone on to write many other books. But this, he was very young when he wrote that, and he risked his life to expose the CIA support for drug traffickers in the Golden Triangle, and he interviewed a lot of DEA agents. The DEA were pissed off with the CIA because they were blocking their investigation, and the DEA would get a man, and he was being protected by the CIA. So a lot of his sources for that book were DEA agents. But yeah, it's a tremendous classic book, and McCoy's a brilliant writer, so I highly recommend that.
Next question.
The second part, if you want to just repeat.
The question was, do you know anything about intelligence connections to the cartels in Mexico?
Well, we just had the trial. I did have an article on Gabriel Garcia Luna, where the highest ranking Mexican official ever indicted in U.S. court and was convicted on major corruption charges. And now what we know is that Luna, he was tied with the Sinaloa cartel. And I mean, the Mexican government and the US and CIA were basically supporting for years the Sinaloa cartel. It wasn't really a war on drugs. It was a war to protect the drug trade and keep it in the hands of the Sinaloa cartel and eliminate its rivals. And there's a long history of the CIA supporting drug trafficking groups and using the drug war as kind of a pretext to go after rivals to its control of the drug traffic. And we know that Garcia Luna had strong connection with U.S. intelligence and U.S. government officials. And there's even pictures of him and Hillary Clinton, and he was very close with members of the Obama administration.
That reminds me. Yeah, that makes sense. Remember that the scandal when Obama was president, where they were funneling arms to one of the cartels. It came out as a big scandal under Obama.
Yeah, the Operation Fast and the Furious.
Fast and Furious. That's right.
Yeah, and I interviewed for my article Tosh Plumley, who's a CIA pilot. Maybe you had him on the show, or he'd be a good guy to bring on. He's 85 years old now, but he goes back to like the Bay of Pigs era, and he knows he's exposed, like he's spoken out about CIA corruption before, and like he said, I'm 85 now. I don't think they're gonna. I'm not afraid that they'll kill me at this age.
Yeah, I remember Alex had him on multiple times. I've heard all those interviews. I'm familiar with him. I've never talked to him, but I know you're talking about him.
I talked to him, and he's a nice guy. And he said the drugs go in, and that's what, like with the Mina operation, I found the drugs go out into South America, and the guns, the guns go down, and the drugs come back here. We send them the guns from America, and so Fast and the Furious, they were directly sending the guns, and then the drugs come back because they don't really want to fight the drug trade because it's such a lucrative business. It funds
a lot of the black operations.
Yeah, it funds black operations. It keeps the economy afloat. It funds banks. The banks help.
Yeah, I forgot about that. If you guys don't remember, it was in 2014, 15, giant Guardian articles everywhere. The top banks busted laundering 300 billion or something like that in drug money. Maybe it was 300 million. I don't remember, but it was like I could find the Guardian article, but it's the top banks out there, and that was 2014 or 15. So
yeah. And I mean, these banks get away with it. Yeah, they don't want to prosecute them. They're found laundering the money. They don't, they don't want the banks to go under. They're worried about the economic effect, or it's just, crony of the banks are paying the politicians directly or indirectly, so they won't go after them.
I think so here's one article in the Guardian, what I was talking about. This is 2011. It might have actually been in Telegraph. So just to I always like to pull up the sources so people don't think I'm just making up stuff. Let's see. Telegraph. It was something like 200, 300 million. I cannot remember what it was. Maybe it was billions. Top drug banks. But people need to know this because this is like Jeremy's saying, this is a big support even for the economy. It's not just black ops. It actually supports the big fake economy that the big bubble debt economy runs on. And I remember reading Crossing the Rubicon many years ago by
Michael Rupert.
Yeah,
I read that book. Yeah, he was a brilliant guy. Yeah.
The thing that really surprised me in the book was that he makes a good case that, and Daniel Esselin makes the same case in his book Shadow Masters, that the drug money actually doesn't just prop up the black ops; it actually props up the big fake economy, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but you guys we'll find that Telegraph or whatever it is article later. But that was a big bomb that dropped. If anybody finds that, put it in the chat. I don't remember. Maybe it's 2011, 12. Maybe it was that far back. But all right, Jeremy, we got two last ones. $9.47 from Comrade Keen. In Soviet Russia, followers by you. Haha, that's a joke to recent Twitter drama there. Rigovich 611, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Rigovich. Again, guys, be sure and follow Jeremy. Thank you so much for coming on. Maybe I'll get you to come back about some of the other articles and information that you drop, because it overlaps a lot with what we talk about over here. Would you want to come back sometime?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Well, thank you very much for